Hey everyone, and welcome to the City of Games. My name is Frank, and today I'd like to talk to you about card dancing, the brand new card system at the heart of my new game, Emberleaf. Now, if you're not familiar with Emberleaf, don't worry, you don't need to know anything about the game to be able to follow through with this video, but maybe check it out afterwards. So I'm going to give you a brief bit of background and then we're going to dive into some examples of how this system works. So you may not know this, but I've been a dancer for a very long time. I've studied salsa, I've studied various types of ballroom dances and specifically quite a lot of jazz, and it's something that was a big part of my life, but I've never been very good at dancing. For me, it doesn't come naturally. And when I think about learning to dance, I break it down into a few steps. I start off with the steps, literally moving my feet from place to place, not really worrying too much about the music or what I'm trying to achieve, just following the patterns, having those steps one by one. And I'm trying to build up to a move by performing a set of steps. I can perform this larger move. And then as I get familiar with it, I try to think about more steps and how I can transition from one move to another move and start following the music, keeping to the rhythm, thinking about the timing of what I'm doing. Now, the important thing here is starting with those smaller steps, moving towards a larger move. You then want to start doing more grander, bigger, more exciting moves and not as many little steps, or at least hiding them amongst what you're doing. And this was a lot of kind of the inspiration of where card dancing came from. So let's dive to the table and have a quick look at how this actually works. You'll see in front of me here, I've got the fellowship board from Emberleaf. Again, don't worry too much about what's going on here, but you'll notice that we've got some villager meeples along the top, we've got various building tiles, and we've got a resource area with 2 beehives in it. Now, for card dancing, the important part is these 8 slots here. These are the card slots where we're going to perform our dance. And you can see to start with, we have got 6 of them which are open and 2 of them which are blocked off by these tiles. You've probably guessed that if we manage to build these buildings, then we're going to get to unlock those spaces and have more place to play. So let's have a look at what we might want to do. We're going to have some hero cards, and in our hand, we're going to be able to place cards onto the board. I'm going to start by taking Wisp and placing Wisp onto the board just here. Wisp could go into any of these 6 slots. Again, these 2 are currently locked. Now, you'll see Wisp has an on-play ability. This is indicated by the lightning bolt symbol, and this means this action happens immediately upon placing it onto your board. This is a very common kind of practice that hopefully you'll be quite familiar with, and as you'll see, it says gather 1 wood per wood stat. Now, I've got 2 wood stats on Wisp, and I've also got 1 wood stat on my fellowship board, which means I'm going to gain 3 wood. I'm going to take 3 wood from the supply and add it to my resource area. Now, this would be considered a step, but I don't want to do that just yet. Instead, I want to prepare a little bit for that first step by doing something else, and I'm going to play Flick. Now, Flick, as you can see, has a sword, a wood, and a food stat in the top left-hand corner, and doesn't have any on-play abilities. Instead, Flick has slide abilities, and these only trigger during a movement, during a slide action. So by playing Flick, nothing is going to happen just yet, but I am going to add some extra stats to the board. Now, the only caveat here is you'll see that I've actually played this into a slot that says gather 1 stone. And on my fellowship board, some spaces, marked by these 3, give you the ability to do the action of the space rather than the card. And because this card doesn't do anything when I play it, I'm going to choose to do the action that's on the space instead, which means I can gather a stone and add it to my supply area. So that is going to be the first step, and now we're going to play Wisp, just like we did earlier, but the difference is now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 wood stats. You see, every time you add a card to your fellowship board, you're going to be increasing the abilities of your other heroes as well as performing the current hero's skills. So we're now going to gather 4 wood instead. These are still fairly small steps, but as you'll see, I'm going to add the 4 wood up to my resource area up here, and I am limited with 8 spaces. That's not really related to card dancing, but it's just worth pointing out at this point. And that is my second step done. Next up, I want to spend some of this resource. I've got quite a lot of it up here. And you can see these buildings on my fellowship board have got costs indicated on them. This one here, for instance, says 4 wood and 1 beehive. I've got 4 wood, I've got 2 beehives and a stone, so I can actually afford to build that building. I'm now going to do another basic step. I'm going to bring in Flint, and Flint has got the build action. This is a on-play ability, so it's going to happen straight away, and now I can activate that skill and build one building. But you'll also notice that Flint has this blue section. This is a drop-off skill, which means it activates when it comes off the board. So if I was to place Flint into this space, sure, I could build now, but as soon as I want to move Flint, it's going to drop off and it's going to do a build immediately. And I might not have the resource. So I'm going to anticipate it's going to take me a little bit longer to be able to do a second build. And I know some of this might be a bit hard to follow, but hopefully keeping up so far. So instead, I'm going to play Flint here. And again, activate the on-play ability, which is build 1. For the purposes of this video, we don't need to worry too much about what happens when we build. I'm simply going to take away my resources and I'm going to be building this house tile down here. So let's assume that we've now built that over onto the board and that has freed up this space. Now, I've got a few heroes on my fellowship board. I've unlocked an additional space and my resources are dwindling. So I think it's time we gather some more resources and then maybe it'll be ready for us to do a bit of a performance. Let me place Sprout down here. And again, this is a gather 1 wood per wood stat card. And I've now got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wood stats. I have actually covered the one on the board, but luckily Flint also came with his own wooden stat. So I'm immediately going to be able to take 5 wood back and put it straight back into my resource area. Now you'll notice that I've actually gone quite wood heavy, and what that means is I'm now generating more resources of the wood variety than I potentially need just from one simple step. But you'll see here Sprout says convert wood to food. I can spend wood to gather food. And this is why Sprout is such a powerful card in this instance, because when we trigger that movement, we're going to be able to start converting our wood into another resource. So let's do a bigger move. We've played 4 cards and we've activated 3 on-play abilities and 1 fellowship board ability, which was the ability underneath. But now we're going to do a slide action. When you do a slide action, you are going to slide every single card on your fellowship board 1 space. We've prepared for our movement, so now we're going to activate it. You always start with the top left corner here, and you go 1 column at a time, top to bottom. So if there was a card here, we would slide it, then we would slide this, and we resolve every card that we slide that has a slide skill. Flint here has a drop-off skill, which doesn't do anything during a normal slide, but you'll see Wisp here does have a slide skill, and it says spend 2 wood to gather 2 stone. Right now, for the purposes of the example, I don't want to get any stone, and this is great because it's always optional if you want to use it or not, so we can choose not to do that. Next, we're going to get to this column. There's nothing at the top, so we're going to slide Flick across. Now, Flick allows us to spend 1 wood to gather 2 food. So I'm going to spend a wood, and I'm going to gather 2 food. Now, this may seem a little bit kind of backwards, but I don't actually want that food, so I can now spend 1 food and get 2 wood. If I spend my food, I'm going to get 2 wood, and in the instances of this game, I can discard other resources, so that is now going to get me right up here and fill up my wood, because I had 1 empty space from the food I spent, and I've discarded the other food to put both woods on there. Now Sprout is going to slide. And again, I've now got great decisions. I could now convert as much of that wood into food if I want to. So do I want to build this building up here, which is 4 wood and a beehive? Or perhaps I want to build some of these, which are going to cost me food and a beehive. Now, It's up to us. At the moment, we're going to stick with the wood just for this example, and that is the end of the move. But what you'll see is within that one slide, we've managed to gather quite a few resources, and we've managed to have these options to convert. We've also now perfectly positioned Flint to the build action. So our next turn, we're now going to do another slide. We're not going to play any more cards. We're already in a good place. And because we anticipated wanting to move Flint into the space, when we now do that slide, Flint is going to be able to come off the board, which is going to activate the build. And when a card comes off your fellowship board, it goes straight back into your hand. There is no discard pile in this game. A card is either in your hand or it's on your board. So Flint triggers a build action for coming off, and again we're now going to be able to spend, let's say, our 4 wood over here. We're going to spend a beehive and we're going to build this boathouse, and that is going to unlock some additional resource locations for us, which means we can now hold 12 instead of 8 resources. We're now going to slide Wisp, and you'll see Wisp again is coming off, but the slides still happen when they come off. We could spend 2 wood into 2 stone, but again, for the purposes of this, that's not what we're going to want to do. So I'm just going to take Wisp off. And whilst we didn't use that slide action twice, we could have used it twice, but we didn't. We have used the on-play ability, and we also gained the wooden stats, which benefited both Sprout and Wisp. So it was still worthwhile playing, even though we perhaps didn't play the card optimally. Now we're going to move Flick across. Flick is going to allow us to spend 1 of our wood. It's going to allow us to gather 2 food. It's then going to allow us to spend 1 of our food, and it's going to allow us to gather 2 wood. And then Sprout is going to go along. Sprout is now going to allow us to convert all of that wood into food. And now we're at a position where we actually have 4 wood and a stone, and we've just finished a build action. So through setting up that combination of cards and placements, rather than now just playing a card to do a build action, we've managed to slide a card to trigger a build, and then slide multiple other cards to then convert resources and generate more resources. So we're now in a position where we could build again. Of course, the buildings on my fellowship board, I don't have the resources for them, but there are other buildings in the game that I would now be able to build if I wanted to. And because the cards that come off come straight back to your hand, Flint is now back in my hand, and I have to make the decision, do I want to put Flint here and have 2 builds, or do I want to put Flint somewhere else and time up where I think Flint might want to go to be able to do that build action. Now, this is the basics of card dancing. We've talked about just playing cards, sliding cards, the combinations and the drop-offs. There are many other things in the game. There are 77 different cards, and some of the actions we've talked about here, these skills, are quite basic. It's gathering resources and building, which are key to the game, but there is a lot more going on. We also have different types of cards. So for example, we've got Loria here. When you play Loria, she actually activates a slide action. So a minute ago, when we had our last setup and we had Flint over here, we had Sprout, we had this one here, and then we had Wisp, instead of just doing a slide action, I could have actually played Loria onto the board, done the slide action like we did, triggered the build, taken Wisp off, brought Flick across, brought Sprout across, gathered the resources, and then Loria's slide action would also have happened, which then would have given me the ability to spend 1 of those foods to gather 3 wood. So now what you're seeing is that that card allows me to do a double action, triggering the slide and benefiting from itself. We have other cards such as Craw over here. Craw is an attack card, and you can see it says on slide, attack anywhere, 1 per 2 swords. I currently have 2 swords, so if I was to do a slide action, I would do 1 per 2 swords. The trick here, though, is the positioning of that card. You see, if Craw was on the board and I now did a slide, I would slide Flick off the board before Craw would do his movement, which means that I now only actually have 1 sword and I'm not going to do any damage. However, if I was to have placed Craw up here, Craw would have slided first and would have still had 2 swords, including itself, even though it slides off, before Flick came off the board. But that may not have been beneficial for me because, again, I'm only going to get to use it once and then everyone gets to attack when that drops off. So instead, maybe I'd rather play Zinra first. Zinra is going to give me 3 extra swords. So by having Zinra in place and doing an attack 5 on play, that's going to give me lots and lots of sword stats. I now have 5, so I'm going to do 2 damage, 2 for 4. It rounds down from the 5, and I'm going to be able to, every time I slide craw, do much more damage. However, of course, if I put Zinra here, those swords are also going to drop off. So maybe I'm going to want to put Zinra over here. So now, even once Flick is gone, Craw is still going to have 4 swords for a guaranteed 3 slides. So that positioning play is really key. With Zinra, you'll notice it says when this card drops off, remove this hero from the game. So this means that Zinra is going to come in and do a big attack of 5, boost every other combat character by an extra 3 swords, but then is going to run off into the wilderness once they've finished their tasks. So you're not going to want to slide too much, so the timing around that card is really important. Likewise, we're also going to now just bring these 2 back off, and we're going to look at Puck. Puck is another card I'd like to show you, and you can see with Puck, Puck says when it slides, place 2 food and 1 stone on this card. So if I was to place Puck over here, when it slides off, I would get to place 2 food and a stone on it, and when it drops off, I could add that resource to my resource area. So when Puck drops off, I can immediately basically get those 3 resources. However, if I was to place Puck up here, Puck is going to slide 4 times, each time allowing me to add an additional 2 food and stone. So by the time Puck comes off, it's going to have 12 resources on it. And if I manage to have got maybe this tile is built and I've managed to get my build card underneath it, then I might be able to slide Puck off, generate 12 resources, and then do a build straight away. Finally, let's just talk about some of the other types of triggers that you might find in the game. Like with Myra here, you see we've got a purple ability. Purple abilities are ongoing, and whilst they're on your fellowship board, they are going to always trigger if you meet the criteria. When you spend at least 1 beehive, gather a stone. So if we had Myra on the board earlier on, when we built up our house over here, that cost us a beehive, and we would have been able to get a stone for the pleasure of doing that. So again, with Myra, you're going to want them on the board as long as possible. Finally, let's talk about Hops, who has a charge ability, and some cards are going to have these charge abilities. They have different numbers. Most of them are 1, but there are 2s and 3s, and that refers to how many times you can use them, but they are effectively like an anytime action that you can do on your turn, as well as playing and sliding cards. So if Hops is on the board, perhaps I want to position Hops around the timing of Puck, so when I get those 12 resources, I can then spend 1 stone from my resource area, place it onto Hops to activate this charge, and then I'm going to get to do a build action. So let's just summarize all of this up a little bit. Card dancing is all about playing cards. As you play cards onto your board, they're going to give you abilities that are going to activate straight away, and they're going to give you stats that are going to then benefit future cards you play. The longer you have them on your board, the more those stats are going to help all of the future cards you play. As you get more cards in play, you're then going to want to do slide actions, which resolves all of those cards move 1 space to the left, which are going to trigger slide actions, which are going to give you the ability to combo stuff up and effectively perform multiple things in 1 turn rather than a simple on play. However, as they slide, cards will drop off, losing you stats. They may trigger drop off abilities, but they return them to your hand. So you're going to want to think about where you position cards onto your board for optimal play, but also when you want them to drop off, when you're going to be able to replay them and so on, because you don't want to get a card tied up in the wrong space, so you can get optimal play out of it. Anyway, we'll talk more about Emberleaf and other parts of the game in the future, but this is a rather kind of detailed overview of how some of the card dancing systems work, and there's a lot more to it. Triggers with villagers being placed, with score bonuses, with meeting objectives, with comboing, with fighting and so on, how it all plays into those combos and triggers. But that's for another video. If you've got any questions at all, please let me know down in the comments below, and until next time, keep on adventuring.